Okay, so we wait for this to dry and it's all clean now, all bone dry. I can put my fingers over it. So uh, we left off with Kevin laying in sort of the general value shapes on the piece of watercolor paper here, and we have not touched anything in the lights, right? We are not touching the lights. We're just focusing on things that are in shadow relatively. So what I like to do is I like to work off of something that I know is a guaranteed dark, which is sort of this background here, this background that's all the way around the can. Okay, so let me go ahead and dip right into my raw sienna. I just lay it in even further, making sure to keep in mind that we have light and dark value shapes butting up against each other, creating this edge of the cup. And I don't want to mess with the edge that we've created here because it works. And if it works, it doesn't need any fixing, right? And so the reason why I start with a raw sienna if I've stepped away from the painting for a while is because it gives me room to get back into the groove of it, and I can then become bolder as I move forward with this. Okay. And so I think I can go a little bit bolder. So I'll have a bit of this brown and I'll work it into the background here. The paint is still wet, so there's a good chance that I won't be able to have a really dark saturated kind of application of this, but I think it'll be dark enough to where I can work further with these other dark shapes that we have. I'm watching out for creating just sort of harsh values here. Okay, so I think this is good enough for the background, right? So let's look at my image here. So I'm seeing that on the top edge here of this can that it gets dark, but not as dark as the background, but it gets really close. So I'm just gonna push it with the raw sienna because I know the raw sienna can't get any darker than what the brown gives us. Okay. And something I like to do here too is that since we do have, it does grade it just a little bit, just go ahead, and I'm seeing the same value across this way. It's interesting metal. It doesn't always follow exactly what you expect normal forms to do, which is if it's in light, it should be in light, right? But it's simply reflecting kind of the dark surroundings around it, right? Unless we were looking more straight on to it, I think we'd see a little bit of the reflection of the light source, but that's just how it is. Okay, and I'm also noticing, and right behind this cylinder here, the cast shadow of the cylinder itself is much darker than any of the shadow that is sort of being wrapped around the form itself. So I definitely want to make sure I note that. And to some extent, sometimes if the shadow is such a close, if the shadow dives into a surrounding that's behind it that is darker, and it is really close in value, you can even get away with doing what's called a lost edge or soft edge. That might be kind of a fun little thing we can do on this here. Noting other areas where it's darker. Not paying attention to the lights. So there's this sort of triangular shape up here. It's just a tad bit lighter than this shape right here. And then it gets softened up. And I'm going to jump around to this lemons cast shadow right here. It's a pretty stark shadow, so I'm going to treat it similarly. Because I know I can feel safe to make something like this dark. Now I'd caution going as dark as you can right off the gate, because sometimes what you think is really dark might not be so dark, right? So we have kind of a transitionary shape right here. Just kind of fill in a little bit more. It gets dark right here. I'm trying to keep it nice and light so I can work over it further. Take a look at the photo here. So it gets really dark around here too. And I'm just going to keep it nice and loose. I'm not gonna fuss too much about whether or not the transition is just right. Just want to make sure I get the gist of it all. And I'm not trying to outline things. So I think this table here is just a little bit darker. We're trying to leave the lights alone, but some things are you can't ignore. The assignments or the pictures that we'll be giving you are pretty obvious in the color of the forms. So we're trying to choose things that are generally uniform in their color. But I think it wouldn't hurt just to have sort of like a darker little sliver of shape here. I'm not outlining, I'm just trying to find where the darkness hits right there. Okay. I think I can probably squeeze in a little bit more value around this area and back here because the light is falling off. It's not a perfectly strong and far away light source like the sun where we're going to have gradations, right? So it's going to just find its way into shadow. And I'll just call this sort of a lost edge because you kind of lose the sense of where it's going by the time it hits this point right here. Any excuse to have lost edges are really, really good excuses because they can look really cool. I'm just gonna push this dark area behind you a little bit more just because I think it could use it. Sometimes if I need to make things darker, you can't always solve it with adding more watercolor onto it because it needs to dry and set up so that it can accept more pigment. Right? Okay. So this coarse shadow right here could probably just travel down a little bit more. I won't fuss too much with it. Thinking this needs to get a little bit darker because it's far away from the light, but it's still reflecting some light. So I'm just going to nudge it a little bit closer to a darker value. But I'm not going to make it as light as here. Okay. And I'll add value that just kind of ekes it towards there. I think I can dip into some of the brown here, the sepia, whatever it's called. I can kind of suggest some of it in now that I've built up enough pigment. That's a little bit too strong. I need to water it down just a little bit more. Now the can here, it doesn't, there's sort of a lighter lip around the top edge of this can, and it's really nice how kind of razor thin it gets. I think I kind of want to keep something like that. And there's a lot more happening here, right? I'm not going to try and get too much into detail. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to suggest the idea that there's a lot happening there through value and shape. So I'm going to go ahead and get a little bit more of this raw sienna. Just going to sort of follow what's going on here. I'm not dragging my brush like I'm outlining. Just trying to get the gist of it. And I can see that there's a highlight right here and right here. So I'm going to leave that alone too. Right. I think what I have is kind of a lot darker. So I'll just move it across this sort of shape that we put in our transfer earlier. And then it transitions out to something lighter as we go this way. Okay. Again, because I don't want to have too many little dots of light here, I want to save those light areas right where those two highlights are. So really what I'm doing is I'm adding probably 2 extra layers of value into this. Oops. I don't know how that happened. Just kind of pulled up like that, didn't it? And go ahead and take these out. Because I'm working at an angle, the paint just kind of wants to settle down that way. So I'll just take a clean brush. It's not too wet, and I'll just kind of take out that little puddle. And what I can also do with a clean brush is I can kind of drag some paint out for these reflected lights while they're still wet. I think the shadow needs to get a little darker. It's not nearly dark enough in value to be noticeable. I think I'll dip into the brown a little more on this one. I'm not going to try and push it too much. Just want to make it a noticeable difference. That's what we're looking for. So really it's just sort of a game of once you get an area darker, you'll find out what other areas need to get darker as a result, or what areas look a little too light. And there's a little bit of a kind of sliver of dark cast shadow under this piece of paper here. I think it's worth putting in. It takes only a couple seconds just to add occluded shadows like that. It's really an occlusion and a cast shadow if you think about it. That's kind of a fun thing to include. Right. It just gives it a little bit more of a three-dimensional quality without much work. All right. So I'm looking over at my reference here. I'm thinking this middle area needs a little bit more work. It needs to get a bit darker so that we get more of that feeling that this is dipping into shadow. I'm just going to get a general lay-in of a dark value. I'm kind of strategically daubing my paintbrush just to remove a little bit more pigment so that I can just have a more subtle application of paint. Okay, so I can definitely get darker here. I think we could just lose the edge all across with the brown here. But as you can see, I'm trying to keep the overall structure that we established earlier after the transfer, that I am working into areas that I have already established as shadow, right? So I'm leaving the lights alone as much as I can, right? And it's very tempting to get into them because you just see this blank space, right? It looks like something that needs to be worked on. As you can see, you can quickly get to something that looks like it's meant to be blank or white or empty. Okay, so I'm going to move on to this lemon here. And so what we usually have with circular objects like this lemon or cylinder is we have usually the very edge in which it finally starts turning into true shadow. We get a darker area known as a form shadow. Oh, I'm sorry, no, it is known as a terminator or a core shadow. Okay, so I'm kind of losing the darkness that I have down here, so I can just get a bit darker. I'm not afraid to dip into the brown here because I already have all this raw sienna built up. And I think I got a little bit too uniform here. So I can make it so that the darkest part is really closer to the middle because I'm not seeing very much core shadow on this edge here, which is a nice little way to hint at how this thing's turning. Okay. All right, so I think that is a simple enough depiction of that lemon that looks like what I'm looking at. And so I'm just going to add a bit of an occlusion shadow underneath the lemon, right where it hits the paper, just to give it a little bit more, just to give us a little bit more meat to look at as a viewer. I'm looking around my reference, trying to pinpoint things that I could emphasize on. I'm just going to work a little bit more on this transition here, this fall off that we have. Not too much. Okay. So it is just a little bit darker right here than it is here. So I just want to make sure that's somewhat noted in painting form through paint. Just go ahead and do it. Do a small little adjustment. Add a little bit more here, where the shadow touches this lighter paper. And then I'll get a little bit more of this brown to kind of separate it too, because it is in shadow. There's a separate piece of paper right here that's overlapping this, but it's, once it dips into shadow, it pretty much gets lost. So that's not going to be something that I'm going to try and find, right? I think there's a little bit to like in the ambiguity of a painting. Just a little bit into this area here. It's not going to be too crazy. I'm mostly trying to leave the lights alone, but since we do have just sort of this large swath of dark area, I am going to address it. But I'm not going to make it too dark. And I'll probably do just another pass of slightly more saturated sienna really quickly, just so that we get a little bit more of fall off happening on the sides here. Getting just a little bit more fall off here. I'll just note it really quick. I'm not going to touch the lights. Try not to touch the lights very much. All right, so I've quickly built up the initial lay-in with pretty much 2 extra values, right? So we go from, so our first value was the initial raw sienna right here. And then our second value is sort of this transition that we have here. And then our third value would be kind of this dark brown here, right? So it's really more or less 3 values. All right, so we still have these distracting lines in the piece, and I think need to go away. Well, they definitely need to go away. So one of the ways that we can remove lines is just having water. We can move them around. Go ahead and remove it by adding water. Then I'll just lift with towel. I'm just trying to make it less noticeable. You can't entirely remove it, but what we can do is we can hide it. So now I'm just going to go in and indicate that it's getting a bit darker up here. Just gonna, I'm picking something up here. I'm just gonna move it in this way. I think this little occlusion edge just got a bit too bold, so I'm just gonna knock it away. It's already dried, so I think I can kind of make it less noticeable. Okay, adding water and removing. So I'm going to be painting to the edges of these shapes that we've suggested. And I'm painting it right to where our transfer was. The key is just to make sure that it's not as noticeable as it was before, because we're trying to avoid outlines. And it gets a little bit darker as we dive into shadow right here, right before it hits the lemon visually. So that's a good opportunity for us to hide some of our transfer still. Destroying all the work that we've done just to kind of lay this all out. Just gonna make this look the transfer never existed, or we'll try. And as I'm going about this, I'll just try and find places that I can hit again too, right? As a result, it made this look a lot lighter. So I'll just sort of dial that back in a little bit more. Sort of a darker color. I'll hit the shadows first because I know that those need to go a bit darker as a result, probably. Just kind of hitting this background area again. Okay, and as things get darker, right, like I said before, you'll start seeing things that probably need to go darker too as a result, right? Again, if you want to hit these sort of dark background areas, you're likely going to have to go a couple times if you want to reach a desired level of value. So it might look like I'm hastily adding stuff in, but I'm being very careful where it matters the most. There's sort of this like light area here that's a bit distracting too, so I'm just going to go ahead and move that closer to the shadow. This lemon could have a little bit more of that treatment too. Doesn't get super duper dark, but I think it's noticeable enough. Now we can nudge it into the composition. I'm just looking a little bit closer into this lighter area here and finding ways that I can incorporate the value so that it makes this initial lay-in of this edge a little bit less noticeable. Sometimes I just make random streaks because I forget how much pigment's on my brush. You can easily solve that by diluting your brush in water and scrubbing it around. Okay. And again, I'm just trying to eliminate these sort of distracting tick marks that were part of the initial transfer. Okay, so I'm getting about to the point where I think I can leave this alone. Just making sure that I communicate these terminators or these core shadows in the painting. I think this gets dark enough to where I can kind of dive it deep into darkness, not too much. I'm going to take a bit of a drier brush and just spread this around a little more. A little bit of an occlusion shadow underneath this can here because it's not a perfect, it doesn't perfectly end there, right? There's a little bit of a lip that curves down, so light can't travel down there. So I think that just about does it for now on this painting.